Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The State of Trade, Where Does U.S.-China Trade Go Now? This webinar is part of our State of Trade webinar series, a monthly series of experts offering timely insights into the rapidly changing world of international trade. Before we get started, let's cover a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you can see multiple application widgets that you can use. You will find a copy of today's slide deck. You will find Bob Davis's most recent book and some of Damien Ma's work. I'll introduce them in just a second. And those are included in the additional materials section on the bottom left. You can also find an article that I wrote from Foreign Affairs on whether it was a good idea to let China into the WTO. Please join us next week for our monthly Logistics Rewired webinar. We'll discuss streamlining collaboration with suppliers. And you can find a link to register for that on the top right. We invite you to ask questions through the Q&A widget on the right. If time permits, we will get to as many of those as we can. We don't promise. And we invite you also to share with us any other webinar topics that you'd like us to explore or any comments you might have about the program. We're trying to share valuable insights, but we want to know what's valuable to you. And a quick survey in that regard is on the bottom right. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. And an on-demand version of the webinar will be available shortly after the webinar and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Now for the lawyers, please, from the lawyers, for you, please do keep in mind that all information provided in this webinar is presented based on the situation at the time and may not be customized to your specific situation. And now the good stuff. Well, almost the good stuff. First, I'm your host. I'm Phil Levy. I am chief economist at Flexport. But we have two excellent panelists joining us today to discuss what's going on in U.S.-China relations. First, we have Bob Davis, senior editor at the Wall Street Journal. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning senior editor based in Washington, D.C. He covers economic issues and writes incisively about China, where he was posted from 2011 to 2014. He is the co-author with Ling Lei of the excellent Superpower Showdown, a history of U.S.-China trade and economic standoff, some of which we'll be discussing today, but it's an excellent book. I recommend it. He's served as the journal's bureau chief also in Brussels, covering the EU and the Latin American bureau chief, and he's coming to us from Washington, D.C. Bob, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And we also have Damien Ma, who is director of and co-founder of Macro Polo, the think tank of the Paulson Institute. He is the author-editor of a number of books, including In Line Behind a Billion People, How Scarcity Will Define China's Ascent in the Next Decade, and has also taught, as I did, at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. Damien, wonderful to have you with us. He's coming to us from Chicago.
Thank you, Phil. Great to be here.
Yeah. All right. And so now on to business. Here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to take on the issue of where do we go next in U.S.-China economic relations. There's obviously even more relations. We're going to focus on the economic part. And the plan is that we're largely going to pick up the story with the Trump administration's approach, which one could argue, we'll put this up for debate, but could argue was a radical break in the way the U.S. dealt with China. And we're going to go from that to discuss what can we expect under the Biden administration. As a warm-up, as a way to get us started, and because I have the microphone, let me just offer a few ideas to characterize the pre-Trump era in U.S.-China relations. This happens to be something I worked on. I was at the State Department when Bob Zoellick was developing his responsible stakeholder policy. So let me give you three ideas on this. Idea number one, something to keep in mind, and this I think is indisputable, it's important to remember that China's economic prominence changed radically over time. So if you look right now, China is just under 20% of world GDP. If you go back as recently as 2000, that number was something more like 3%. So it's sometimes hard to sort of go back in time and sort of recognize that difference, but it's a much more prominent role than it was earlier. So idea number one was sort of growing prominence. Idea number two, China's leadership, ideas, and motivations have changed significantly over time. When China joined the WTO in 2001, it was under a reforming administration that wanted a bigger role for market forces and looked to the West as an example. That became much less true. I would date it back to the global financial crisis, but my my colleagues here may have a different take. But the point being, there's certainly been change over time in the Chinese approach. It has not been a constant. And I guess the third idea that I would put forward is that U.S. commercial diplomacy towards China had, at least until the Trump administration, been very much an attempt at the art of the possible. It was seen as unlikely that the U.S., even when China was much smaller, that the U.S. could simply demand whatever it wanted of China and that China would accommodate. Whether or not that was done optimally is another question, something one could certainly debate. All right, so we're about to have Bob tell us whether he agrees with what I just said and what we saw during the Trump administration. I don't think I'm giving anything away to note that there was a trade war, that all of you are aware of this. We had it, lots of tariffs in a way that we really had not had before. So going in, we're going to warm up with the first of 3 polls that I'm going to pose to you, the audience. This is where you sit up straight in your chair, you participate. So the question, the first one we're going to hit you with is, do you think this Section 301 trade war, the one where all the tariffs came from, between the United States and China, launched in 2018, was, and then here are your choices, was it a worthwhile endeavor with strong signs of success, or a worthwhile try but not ultimately successful? Was it misguided from the start and unsuccessful? Is it too soon to tell whether it succeeded or not? And then we give you the final out, which is, I don't know, that's why I tuned in. So let me ask you all to register your opinions. Take a moment, let us know what you think heading into this. We'll tally it all up and use that as a basis to then launch our discussion with Bob. So again, looking back at the trade war that launched in the summer of 2018, continuing on until the present, actually, because these are the bulk of the tariffs that are still in place. What is your take on it? Was it a worthwhile endeavor, successful, worthwhile try, not successful, misguided, unsuccessful, and too soon to tell whether it succeeded or not, or you'll take a pass? So, all right, we've got a lot of votes. This is great. You are all clearly engaged. I'll give you one more moment. Thank you for playing. Going once, going twice. All right, so here's what we get. Interestingly, we've got a plurality that says it was misguided from the start and unsuccessful. That's 46.7%. Only 6% saying that it's strong signs of success. There's about a sixth of you, 17.4%, say too soon to tell. The number keeping an open mind, and then about 20% saying it was worth a try but not ultimately successful. This gives us a lot to chew on, and we'll sort of come back to this, but I want to, at the moment, turn it over to Bob to talk about, first, whether you're welcome to reject my lead-in if you like, but what did we see under the Trump administration? What was distinctive about this approach? Where did it leave us?
Well, again, thanks for having me. I think the most relevant thing you said to the way I think about it anyway, the Trump approach, was the bigger, much larger share of the global economy that China occupied. So let's go back even further. It's 2016. It's the presidential campaign. You know, Donald Trump is campaigning as the person who's going to take on China with tariffs of 50%. At that point, he was talking about China was raping the U.S. That was the language he used, raping it economically. And he was, he was coming in there, ready with a shotgun loaded and all that. And he had some people like Steve Bannon, who certainly one of the reasons he signed on for the campaign was because of China. However, for the first year in change, there was basically nothing, right? I mean, think back. He had Donald Trump had a summit with Xi Jinping by April. I mean, Biden is nowhere near even meeting with Xi Jinping, and China was basically off stage. I mean, where Trump's focus in the beginning was North Korea, and China in the traditional foreign policy, view was, well, China could help with North Korea. North Korea is really the issue, and so let's try to court China as a way to help on our problems with North Korea. that lasted for more than a year until the administration kind of gave up on that and realized that Xi Jinping wasn't, was going to deal with North Korea if he felt it was in his interest, but wasn't going out of his way, particularly for the United States. So what made the difference? I think an enormous difference was Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, getting confirmed to start with, and then figuring out bureaucratically how to make his influence felt. And so he brought to that incredibly chaotic administration, an expert's view of trade and a very hawkish view about China. So, as you all know, he started Section 301 report, which, was basically, a declaration of trade war, right? It was essentially saying that China was cheating and was pressuring U.S. companies into giving away, valuable technology. That's what he cared about. Those are fundamental issues that I think are very appropriate. But again, he works for the president. What did the president care about when it came to China? He cared about narrowing the trade deficit. You can argue that's a dumb, particularly bilaterally, that's not a proper measure, but meanwhile, that's what he believed. And the only way, if you're Lighthizer and you're working for a boss, the way you make sense of this is, well, let's get China to buy more stuff, right? And so that became another one of the objectives. So there were, kind of soldered onto each other, buy more stuff, and then these very fundamental issues. And it went on, as you know, for 2 years, back and forth, more and more tariffs. The tariffs initially were meant to compensate the United States for what the calculation was, the impact of forced technology transfer. But after that, it was all punitive. It was to try to twist China's arm into doing what the United States wanted. And it proceeded that way, around September 2018. And what was the change, right? What was the change? Basically, Donald Trump threw tariff after tariff after tariff on China, and with no real cost at all. But by September 2018, the stock market was starting to react to every little twist and turn. I can tell you, as a person writing these stories, every little twist and turn, the market would go up, the market would go down. And as the election came closer and closer, that became a big issue because the president cared a lot about the stock market as a measure of success. And so at that point, Lighthizer basically decided he needed a deal. He needed a deal. The fights that he had, and I can go on endlessly in the book, our book, Superpower Showdown, goes into a great deal of detail about the back and forth and the fights between the various personalities. But at that point, he works with Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin, National Economic Council Director Kudlow, into getting what he felt was the best possible deal he could get. And so, you have this result where there's some improvement, I would argue, in terms of intellectual property and so on. And there are these totally fantastical promises, to buy more stuff. I think it was always fantastical, but at the very same time, and I think it's coincidental, but at the very same time, the trade war is over and they sign a deal, COVID starts sweeping across the United States. And that changes everything once again. And so Donald Trump, who had not been particularly aggressive on China on non-economic issues, basically gave the head to Pompeo, to the National Security Council, to take one action after another on issues like Xinjiang, repression of Muslims in Xinjiang, the actions of the party when it came to Hong Kong. And in a weird way, the trade war, 2 years of a trade battle, trade relations between the U.S. and China became one of the few strands holding this relationship together. And Lighthizer and his counterpart in China, the Vice Premier Liu He, had a very good relationship and worked out. And it's interesting. I'll end here, but it's interesting. So the day after or maybe it was the first day. I think it was the day after that Biden was sworn in. The Chinese sanctioned a whole variety of former Trump officials. It was interesting to note that Lighthizer was not one of them, because he was, again, the trade issue was one of the very few things holding things together.
That is interesting. Damien, I want to get your take on this as well. What, if you were going to sort of broadly characterize what was different, effective, ineffective about the Trump years? Bob just gave us a nice summary, which actually is remarkable for how much he simplified what happened. The details are in the book, but the going back and forth, who's running things, is it Lighthizer, is it Mnuchin, who's doing this? It was a masterful summary. Damien, what's your overview of the Trump administration experience?
Well, to piggyback off of what Bob said, I think he touched on some of the fundamental issues of the Chinese economy that I think for a long time the United States government was not pleased with, and critiques, market access barriers, those forced technology transfers, subsidies to industry, IP. You can go down a list. Currency for a while. When you were in D.C., that was a big issue as well, although it's less of an issue now. I think the idea for a lot of, so-called the policy wonks in D.C., they were hoping for a phase 2 that would eventually tackle some of these longstanding problems. But we never got there. And I think those were really the key issues for, if you're talking about U.S. corporate, U.S. companies, U.S. investors, it was those sort of behind the borders competitive issues. Technology being foremost one of them. Those were the issues that people really wanted addressed.
We'll delve into the issues more in a second, but one of the things I think the Trump administration seemed to pride itself on, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, was that it was supposed to be a radically different take. They had been very critical of predecessors for having endless dialogues, strategic dialogue, strategic and economic dialogue, and getting sort of broad promises on issues. Bob, you described these as somewhat sort of fantastical, the sort of numerical targets, but wasn't that supposed to be the thing that was different? And actually, I'm going to now give each of you in turn, Bob, you first, then you, Damien, a chance to weigh in on that poll question, which we posed to the audience, on as we look back at the Section 301 trade war, successful, unsuccessful, misguided, worth a try. That's a bunch of stuff to throw at you, Bob, but why don't you go first, and then we'll turn back to Damien.
I forget exactly what the choices were, but I would go with the worthwhile try, and didn't work out. I mean, that's,
okay.
I sort of looked at it. I mean, I think what was different wasn't the effort to push the Chinese to buy more stuff. I mean, I guess it's different to have specific and supposedly enforceable targets. That is true. But I think what was really different about it was to try to deal with these structural issues, Chinese pressure on U.S. companies to hand over technology. That part they tried, but subsidies of Chinese state-owned companies, the behavior of Chinese state-owned companies. I mean, those had been issues before, but to try to deal with them in a forceful fashion by imposing tariffs on them, I think that was very, very different. The other thing, to Lighthizer makes this point. I think he's right. You mentioned the endless dialogue, strategic economic dialogues, and so on, the joint JCCT, whatever that stood for. I mean, what they would wind up with was a gigantic press release of 30 things the U.S. promised to do and 30 things the Chinese promised to do, but there was no enforcement. It was just a press release. I mean, in this, whatever you think of this trade deal, it is a signed trade deal between two countries. Whether Biden tries to enforce it or not is an issue, but that is also, I think, significantly different.
Yeah, and I'm going to come in just 1 second to this trade deal and the whole phase 1, phase 2. But before we do, Damien, your take on this question of the Section 301 trade war: successful, unsuccessful, misguided, worth a try?
I think we have enough evidence now to you see the bilateral deficit going up. Part of that is obviously because of COVID and the pandemic, but I think the evidence suggests it was probably likely the misguided. It was a wrong tool to achieve the outcomes that we would wanted. It got some things, but in terms of sort of some of those longer term issues, if the intent was to use that tool to get more behavior modification on the Chinese side, that was not achieved.
And was that foreseeable?
Yeah.
Was there any reason to think that would make the Chinese move?
Of course, that was foreseeable because from Beijing's perspective, they looked at it as sort of the Japan playbook of the 1970s and 80s, and they lumped it with the Plaza Accord back in the day. That's how they looked at it, and they were obviously not going to bend, in that sense.
Yeah. All right, so I want to take, for both of you, before we sort of leave the experience of the Trump administration, this is also going to be your chance to make last points on this. Draw on some of the work done here by the Peterson Institute and Chad Bound there, talking about the phase one trade deal. So a couple of aspects of this. First, it was phase one. There was supposed to be a phase two, which dealt with more of these issues you had described. But second, it did present numerical targets. This was sort of how it was supposed to move beyond these communiques that Bob described, where you made a bunch of empty promises that were hard to enforce or hard to check. And what we see here, somewhat in miniature, but on the screen, is there were a lot of promises. It was a pretty one-sided deal in terms of the promises were mostly Chinese promises to purchase more. And for whatever reason, obviously we did have a pandemic and other things happen, we fell short on those promises. So, Bob, maybe I can ask you at the start, how did we end up with this breakdown into phase one and phase two? And did people know that this was going to happen, or do you see this as a pandemic surprise? How does that particular deal look in retrospect?
Well, the way they wound up with phase one and phase two is because, as I was mentioning, around September 2018, they realized they wanted a deal, and they couldn't get a deal on the structural issues. And I forget whether it was Lighthizer or Mnuchin, but somebody came up with the idea of like, oh, let's call it phase one and then phase two. And they joked among themselves. It's like whenever they hit a hard target, a hard issue in another area, they'd say, okay, well, that's a phase two issue. So I think from the beginning, they realized the chances of a phase two agreement were vanishingly small. But they were looking, to get the best deal they felt they could get at that particular time. So I don't think the last administration never really thought that they had much of a chance for a phase two negotiation before the election. If Trump had won and Lighthizer stayed on, yeah, I think you could imagine there might be, because, from Beijing's point of view, this would be, it was a very difficult administration to deal with, right? And so maybe they would have engaged in a phase two. I mean, with the Biden administration, I honestly don't know. I think the bigger issue to start with is, are they going to, enforce the phase one, or try to enforce the phase one deal at all, right? Or remove any of the tariffs. I mean, so let alone a phase two. But I don't think it was never seen as a realistic alternative in the relatively short term. I mean, meaning in a year or so, maybe post-election again if Trump had won.
Do you think there was an expectation that those numerical targets would be met?
On the U.S. side?
Yeah.
I mean, they just seem so outlandish. It's hard to imagine they really thought they would be, even before COVID. But, well, yes. Okay, I'm just thinking this over. Yes, because they have this view, and I'm curious what Damien would think. They have this view, this kind of storybook view of China, that the Chinese government and the party can do whatever it wants. All it needs to do is snap its finger, and this company and that company will do exactly what they want. Whether they lose money, whether they don't, whether they're privately owned, whether they're not. And so to the critics, who said, what you're doing is reinforcing the pattern that you want to get away from, right? I mean, they're reinforcing state authority, by requiring the state to, to order companies to buy things. buy U.S. goods. To which the Trump people would say, we're just recognizing reality. That's the way China is. So, yeah, I suppose they did think they would actually hit those targets.
So, Damien, what's your view on this? Was that sort of the driving? I think we don't think that this finger snapping actually works, but was there any realistic way that China could have met these?
I think, if you looked at every single sector, I mean, there was an energy target, there was an agricultural target, there were several, pretty aggressive targets. I mean, on the energy side, I don't think every single target was going to be realistic, but I think, something on agriculture, perhaps there was, there was some sense there that could be met, because obviously there were also some political reasons there for ag purchases. So I don't, it was also not entirely clear what the timetable was for exactly meeting, these targets. And obviously the hope was to have it done before the election. But I don't think the Chinese thought it was entirely realistic to have kind of met every single target across the board. I mean, there's only so much, natural gas that they're going to need in any given year. And there's a limit to that, especially with the economy slowing down, I mean, let's not forget the economy, contracted pretty significantly in China too.
It did. Yeah. What do we think of the point that Bob made, which is who would be in charge of these purchasing decisions in China? That is this a centralized process? Are you working decision-making, private groups? How does this fit into the way China actually makes purchasing decisions?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of stakeholders. Obviously, the guy, in the lead is Vice Premier Liu He, who did a negotiator and sort of, is Xi Jinping's point man on most economic issues, and especially the U.S.-China economic relationship. So he would be the lead, but still they have to work through a lot of stakeholders. It's certainly not the case that all central state-owned enterprises are going to just say, well, we agree and we will just buy this stuff because that's just not how it works. He has to mediate, and they have to sort of get to a point where stakeholders agree, that they're going to do certain things. And there's a lot of sausage making behind the scenes that we're not really seeing. It can't be sort of Liu snaps his fingers and all 150 central SOEs or 105 now or something like that. We'll just say, well, okay, we will each meet $20 billion of purchases. That it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way.
All right. Lots of good stuff in the Trump administration. We're going to come back to the audience now as a lead into delving more into some of the issues. And Damien previewed some of these. But back to all of you. In your opinion, the single most important commercial issue between the United States and China right now, so as we're moving from the Trump administration, we're into the Biden administration, is it tariffs? Is it intellectual property protection? Is it state-owned enterprises and subsidies? Cyber attacks? Economic coercion, for example, leaning on Australia to behave differently? Or is it the trade deficit? So again, your choice is tariffs, intellectual property protection, state-owned enterprises and subsidies, cyber attacks, economic coercion, or the trade deficit. Some of those we leave some interpretation. We're asking you to pick your favorite, or the one that you think is sort of most salient. This, of course, is one of the big challenges in the relationship is there are a broad number of issues. This is something we'll talk about. And which one is really assigned the lead position. All right, many of you have voted. I'm going to wait just a moment or two to let the rest of you choose, register your opinions. So single most important commercial issue between the United States and China right now. All right, we are getting towards a quorum on this. A few more votes and we will be there. Speak now. Well, you don't have to forever hold your peace. We're going to have one more poll, but at least on this one. All right, going once, going twice. Survey says tariffs. Tariffs are still a big deal. Of course, the tariffs are often sort of they're still heavily in place. So we have tariffs at 43.5%, intellectual property protection at 23.9%. The trade deficit comes in at 13.2%, then state-owned enterprises and subsidies, cyber attacks with economic coercion being the last of these. Damien, what's your take on this? Does that surprise you as a ranking?
It does. It does. I mean, what I would, in my view, I would say the most important issue that's adjacently related to state-owned enterprises and subsidies is sort of the nexus of technology and industrial policy. That to me is probably one of the biggest issues and will continue to be, I think, one of the dominant issues going forward under the Biden administration. In fact, I mean, I think a lot of debate right now on the U.S. side is whether or not we should have our own industrial policy or sort of revive aspects of it in order to compete with China, because that's really where the competition resides, is sort of technology and industrial policy.
Now, there's a trade-off there where you could be considering two different factors. One is what has the biggest economic impact on the U.S., and the other is how likely is it that we're going to actually get success in this area? How are you weighting those two when you pick issues?
That's a good question. I would say, technology. When you talk about economic coercion, obviously every country has economic coercive tools. We do as well, and I think we've seen some of those being used under the Trump administration, like export controls and so on. I think Bob can speak to. I think he just wrote a piece about who gets the posts under commerce for BIS, which is runs export controls. So and there are various other tools. So I think it can be somewhat successful, but I think ultimately when it comes to technology and industrial policy, it's as much about the U.S. domestic economy as it is about kind of the bilateral relationship. And so I think the big debate right now is how effective is it to primarily slow China down versus running faster ourselves. And I think that's really the debate. And so, a lot of the things that the Trump White House have done is sort of trying to slow China down. And, in some aspects, I think on advanced chips, that has actually kind of worked to a degree that I think people didn't expect. And in part is because I think it revealed, significant weakness in the Chinese industrial economy, but it also has prompted them to now basically say, we're going to be all in on chips. And we're going to try to establish some semblance of self-independence when it comes to chips. So it had kind of that adverse effect.
Right, adverse, because that was one of the original concerns the Trump administration had pointed out, some of these China 2025 independence approaches. Bob, let me get your take on this in terms of just the issue agendas, either a reaction to the rankings that our audience gave, or just what you see as the most salient issues.
No, I'm surprised also. I mean, I think my comments are along the line of what Damien was saying. I mean, I think we have, even in the last administration, we had shifted from a trade war to a technology, a confrontation, let's say. And I agree also. I mean, the last administration was all about defense. How can we hold back China? And this administration, I think, is not different, frankly. I mean, I think there will be a continuation on trying to limit what China can do, and they believe, and we'll see if this works out, they believe they can do it more effectively because the United States won't be fighting with its European and Asian allies at the same time it's trying to recruit them on China. So I think you will see, an effort toward very strict export controls and other efforts to work with allies on the Chinese version of economic coercion. I mean, certainly, Damien's right that the U.S. and other countries do it as well. So there's that. But in addition, and even more important for this group is what can the U.S. do, right? I mean, take a look at it in the context of Huawei, right? The last administration had, a pretty fair amount of success in restraining Huawei's efforts to become, the monopolist or the sort of the AT&T of 5G, the old AT&T of 5G. They had a fair amount of success, but one of the big problems, to say the least, is, your country X and the United States is saying don't buy Huawei because there are all these problems, and they say, well, what should we buy? What's our alternative? And so I think this administration will be focusing a lot on that particular issue. How to get beyond Huawei on 5G, but other, affirmative, I would call it affirmative issues. How, if you're worried about China leaping ahead of the U.S. in quantum computing, well, what's the U.S. doing? What's the U.S. program? The U.S. is no stranger to industrial policy. It just does it in a different way than China does. But I think both countries agree, most everybody agrees, what the most important technologies of the future are. Now, again, those may be mistaken. We've often made mistakes in thinking we just know what the next technology is. But in any event, I don't think the U.S. list would be any different from the Made in China 2025 list. But the last administration did a very poor job in organizing the U.S. industrial and government nexus on developing new technologies. They could have done a lot more. And I think this administration is going to try to do that.
So, Bob, let me ask you a follow-up question on this. What you had mentioned earlier, some of the things we saw at the very end of the Trump administration, which, if anything, you mentioned Huawei now, which wasn't a new issue at the end. We saw some others like Xinjiang. We saw questions about, for example, delisting Chinese companies from U.S. stock exchanges. Was that a deliberate attempt, do you think, to expand this agenda, and will it stay expanded? Will these new issues stick?
It was definitely an effort to expand the agenda. I think the question you have to ask yourself, would any of this have been done? Anything that they did post-election, would any of it have been done if Trump had won re-election? I'm very dubious, right? If he had known he was going to be in the White House again, would he have wanted to push U.S.-China relations as hard as they did at the end? So, yes, I think, yes, it was an effort to expand it. But meanwhile, it's the government, right? And so this administration has to decide what they're going to keep and what they're not going to keep. And to roll back anything or not follow through on anything can be difficult politically. Let's say a relatively easy one you would think is TikTok, right? The argument that TikTok was a security threat because it collects data like Facebook does, or Google, or any video game, So, and meanwhile, there are tens of millions of users of TikTok, and also TikTok has had some success in the courts. Well, even something like that, which would be a pretty easy one, you would think, to roll back, I think would be difficult, because if they let it drop, there are a half a dozen Republicans in the Senate that are looking to run for president based in large part on, being tough on China. So that's one thing. And also, it's not as if the Democrats are easy on this issue as well. So it's a political minefield for this new administration.
Yeah, and noteworthy that as we look at sort of the early clues on what they're going to do, there are a bunch of things where, at least for the moment, we've had continuity. Particularly, for example, those 301 tariffs are still in place, subject to a review. Let me start with Damien, and then I'll come back to you, Bob, on this. So, Damien, with what you have seen from the Biden administration, either what it said in the campaign, the nominations, and here's some of the key players that they've put forward that it's made. That's not an exhaustive list. There's people like Kurt Campbell playing a prominent role. Things like early phone calls or statements about strategic competition. Do we have any signs where the Biden administration is going on this? And Bob's been writing as well, so I'll give him a turn in a second. But Damien, what's your take?
Yeah, well, I think Bob probably has more insights than I do. I'll just say a few things quickly. I think the basic point here is in my view anyway, there's a higher political cost to kind of reverse certain things that's already in place, like tariffs, than leaving it alone for now. I think the political cost to kind of reversing it's just going to be higher. And so I think in your first 100 days, that's probably not something you might want to touch. Weighing the cost versus benefit of doing so, and not to forget, he's launched a lot of the different task forces. There's one at DoD. There's going to be, I think, a number of them kind of do a thorough review of China policy across the board. But we're obviously talking about the economic side, which I think will also get a review. So I think right now they're kind of in a similar holding pattern. And I think obviously, COVID is dominating, preoccupying all their time and efforts, and that's not a surprise. So, after 100 days, we may see some changes there. But I do think that to the extent the political cost doesn't seem to change that much, that calculus, then I think it might be it will be interesting to see what they actually do or don't do. Meaning, leaving things alone might be a better option than trying to reverse things. Yeah.
Okay, so let's take that, and Bob, back to you on this. The point that Damien just made, that most of our presidents came in where there was a lot of rhetoric, but it wasn't that they had sort of an active trade war going. And there does seem to be this difference, just as Damien said, between taking off a policy or reversing something versus being slow to adopt one. Add that to the sort of political constraints you talked about, where Congress is. How much room for maneuver is there for Biden? And at what point does he then start owning these Trump policies if he stays the course?
It's politically difficult for him. What you can see, I suppose this is something. There's no talk from the Biden camp, either the president or any of his advisors, about more tariffs, right? If Trump was in there, there's tariffs on 3/4 of everything. Could still have, raised the tariff rate or, added more categories to the tariffs. There's no talk of that. There is talk, we'll get around to deciding about rolling back tariffs once we've consulted with our allies, once we can get our people confirmed, once we talk to Congress. That's a lot of discussions, right? So you just can't. It doesn't seem like it'll be for months that they decide. And again, for sort of good reason. Politically, it's a problem, and the Chinese don't seem to be pushing particularly. I think their trade situation isn't bad at all. They're doing much better than people expected them to do, and I imagine that includes analysts in Beijing as well. So it's not really an economic pressure for them. This administration argues, unlike the last, that it's a drag on the U.S. economy, right? But it's not the biggest drag. The biggest drag is obviously COVID, and that's where their focus is. My impression is, if I've said this to some of the people in the administration, my view is like, you want us all to go away for like 2 or 3 months, and then let us work out our policy, and then come back, and we'll tell you what we're going to do. And I think that's sort of the way they would prefer it, because they do have lots of other priorities, and trade in general and China in particular are just so divisive within the Democratic Party, and are kind of layups for Republicans who want to take Biden's job.
And Phil, if I could just add a very quick point to that, which I wanted to tag on to my comments, is I think one of the main lessons, in my view anyway, from the Trump administration, some of the things that Bob talked about, is that it just seems like unilateral decoupling is very hard, whatever term you want to use. You may get a few things done here and there, but ultimately it doesn't seem to work that well. And part of it is because China is a $14 trillion economy. It's the only economy that's got positive growth last year, and it has choices. Just look at, I think it just came out yesterday or a couple of days ago that China is now the biggest trading partner with the EU, overtaking the United States for the first time. And of course, China and the EU are much closer on the issue of climate change than they are right now with the United States. And climate change, if you define it as an economic issue, that's a huge deal there too. And part of why the Chinese and the EU signed their bilateral investment treaty was, a lot of it was because of climate as well. Yeah. So I think just this idea of unilateral decoupling just doesn't seem to. I would say that's one of the main lessons, if I were to take one from the last few years.
Right. It never struck me that they had a particular plan for how it sounded nicer as a theory, perhaps, than as a practice. I want to come to a point that you've now both raised, which the Biden administration, certainly in the campaign and subsequently, made a very big deal about addressing things multilaterally. But if you actually do that, this imposes yet another set of constraints that you don't get to do. It's hard enough to figure out, what the administration wants internally, how that matches with Congress. If you now then have to say, all right, well, and then what do the Canadians and the Europeans and the Japanese think? You add on still further constraints. Bob, do you think this is going to be sort of lip service to a multilateral approach, or is that something they're really committed to?
I think they're committed to it. I mean, I think they're committed to it in a sort of macro sense and a broad sense. The idea of the democratic world versus the autocratic world. I mean, Blinken talked about that. Secretary of State Blinken talks about that a fair amount, but I think it is something that they genuinely will push for. United States democracy as a model for the world is not exactly shining example at the moment. So there's that issue. But in addition, I think they will push for alliances on a whole variety of, let's call it, technocratic issues. But I agree with you. The big question is, is that just tying them up in knots, essentially, right? That is the argument the last administration made as to why they moved unilaterally. It's because the Chinese, they would argue that the Europeans and particularly the Japanese might talk a good game, but they will never impose sanctions. They will never agree to impose sanctions, and only the U.S. will. And so you're better off leading by acting unilaterally. I mean, it is, we see how that worked out, which wasn't really very well for the U.S. But, I don't think even, the people within the administration, other than the president, thought it was a really good idea to fight with your allies at the same time you're fighting with the others. But we'll see. We'll have a real life example, I think, as to whether you can actually, in a reasonably, in a reasonable amount of time, bring multilateral pressure on China. The only example I would use, which has gone out of favor now, is the negotiations to get China into the WTO. There was multilateral pressure, and China changed. People argue now they didn't change enough and all that, and they cheated and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, that was the biggest, forced change on the Chinese economy. I don't know what Damien would say. I would argue it's the biggest forced change in the sense of forced on them by outsiders. It's true that the Chinese reformers, particularly Zhu Rongji, wanted to do it, but still it was foreign pressure. So that's an example where it worked, although that one took, 15 years or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a perfect segue. Damien, let me ask you, we can do it sort of as a continuation of this. How much more effective is multilateral pressure as opposed to bilateral pressure? But then let's broaden out from there. And, China has domestic politics too. How does this all play in China? And what's going to determine whether, from the Chinese side, whether there's change or whether this is a successful relationship under Biden?
Well, I think from Beijing's, vantage point, I don't think it's a fairly, I think it's a fairly obvious view from them as sort of, when you talk about alliances, I think if you're Beijing or if you're Xi Jinping, you just sort of view it as, the United States and its friends kind of ganging up on China is sort of how it's basically viewed. It might be overly simplistic, but that's sort of the way it's looked at. And so I think, to be fair, though, I think Beijing does see that they're facing probably, I would argue, the most volatile and probably one of the worst external environments they've had in about 30 years. And I think they recognize that, which is why they've been busy, because I think, they just don't really know what will happen under Biden yet. I think no one knows for sure. So they're kind of going around to different parts of the world, the EU being the first big, Western market. So they're trying to, hedge their bets a little bit too, because they understand that one of the secret sauce or secret ingredients to China's economic success over the last 30 years was an external was a stable external environment. I mean, that was deliberately what Deng Xiaoping did back in the day, was kind of, make sure all those things were stable so that they could grow. And so, I think the big question for China is whether that window of opportunity is kind of closing, and what does that mean? And can China still be able to, have that environment to grow? Because they're clearly not done. I mean, they've been very clear that their next target is focusing on 600 million people, twice the U.S. population, that still lives on less than $5 a day. So they still have 600 million people doing that, and that's that. So they're, they have very developed, parts of the country, but they also have a huge population that they're trying to take care of, and which is why I would argue that, if you look at the upcoming 14th Five-Year Plan that's going to come up soon, a lot of that is going to be about addressing some of their internal, challenges and equalizing growth across the country, which they've talked about for about 10 years. But haven't really succeeded in doing. And so I wouldn't, I think how China behaves is going to be a combination of, how they see the external environment, and also some of these very quite challenging domestic constraints. Because if you think about, things like labor, demographics, they've got about 10 or 15 years before, it's sort of, there's a point of no return in terms of, how the labor force ages. They're just going to, their population is going to, basically flatline and drop. And the elimination of the one-child policy hasn't had a tangible effect on them, on a baby boom. So, they have some serious headwinds that they got to address over the next 10 to 15 years. So I think, projecting a straight line, sort of China is just going to be, out there constantly, thumping its chest and so on. It's sort of the basic narrative. I'm not sure if that's necessarily always going to be the case, because they have some grave, and I would argue fairly serious concerns that they kind of have neglected for 10 or 15 years, and that they're trying to tackle, I think, starting with the 14th Five-Year Plan.
Yeah, so this is the classic concern about growing old before you grow rich.
And just a lot of distortions. I mean, they're dealing with a debt problem too. They're dealing with, they got 2 or 3 key things, immediate, medium-term, and long-term issues that if they don't start now, it's going to be, it's going to be very hard for them to go from middle income to high income over the next 15 years. Because should we think about this as a sort of consensus with China on facing these issues, or is there a divisiveness internally they have to deal with? Oh, it's going to be politically divisive, because China is going to pivot from sort of a dogmatic focus on growth to what will be the next phase, which is redistribution of wealth, and that inequality. I mean, that in itself is inherently going to be more political, because anytime you do redistribution, it's political. It's a political issue, and I think that's what's on the docket. If you listen carefully to what Xi Jinping is saying, a lot of it is on society, a lot of de-emphasis on growth. I have a running bet with my colleagues about whether there will be an actual growth target in the upcoming plan, and I think that even if there is, it's going to be a significantly weakened target, and so they're trying to shift that way. It's not going to be done overnight, but I think thinking about China as focusing much more on redistribution and inequality versus just growth, I think that gives you a different framework about thinking about next phase of Chinese economic development.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Okay, time is running short because we've covered a lot of good things. Before I ask the two of you where this is all going to take us, where we're going to go with all of this, I'm going to ask the audience. So for our last poll question, we've talked about the Trump administration, we've talked a bit about the Biden administration. So in terms of what you expect compared to the Trump administration, you expect the Biden administration policy toward China will be, and here I'm deliberately a bit vague, but more lenient and worse at achieving its goals, more lenient and better at achieving its goals, tougher than the Trump administration, maybe different in tone, but roughly the same in substance, or I give up, tell me. All right, so this is your last chance to weigh in. So compared to the Trump administration, will Biden policy be more or less lenient? Will it be better or worse at achieving its goals? Or will it end up being roughly the same, where there'll be sort of nods towards multilateral cooperation, but in practice, not really that different? All right, let me give you a few more seconds to vote, see what you say, and we will look at the results. All right, last chance. Thank you for those who have voted. Here we go. The expectations are, let's see, 44% saying maybe different in tone, but roughly the same in substance. Then there's actually about the same who say more lenient, with a split pretty much between whether that's better or worse than achieving his goals. Very few who think that it's going to be tougher than the Trump administration. Well, let me take that as the lead in, and Bob, I'll start with you. What would your answer have been?
None of the above. I mean, I'll give you the reporter's answer, which would be they're going to be tougher in certain spots. They have recruited a fairly hawkish group of, academically minded people setting China policy. I think that they are serious when it comes to human rights issues. And I don't think the last administration was serious. There were serious people in there, but not, not the president. I don't think Trump cared a whit about human rights issues in China. And I think Biden does. So I think they will be tougher. Now, whether that winds up, exploding in their face as it has, prior administrations, that's another issue. And they'll be more expansive. I mean, even the last administration talked about cooperating with China in certain areas. But by the last year, I can't think of one area where they wanted to cooperate. And this administration does want to cooperate with China when it comes to healthcare, global pandemics, climate change, nuclear proliferation, and some other issues. So.
All right. Damien, your take.
I mean, I more or less, I think Bob is basically right on most of it. I would just say I think the first exercise is clearly delineate the areas in which we can have some cooperation, or not because we want to, but probably by necessity, and areas where specific areas where we want to continue or perhaps even be tougher on some of the economic issues. So I think we haven't really done that exercise, really clearly delineate these specific areas, and so I think that's going to have to happen. So it will be it just will not be a one size fits all, exclusively antagonistic kind of way, both in tone and substance. But in certain areas, I could see us perhaps tougher is the wrong word, perhaps more effective is maybe the right way to think about it.
Okay. Well, so we've got time for at least for one question, but in fact, we've had one question which has been asked a number of times. So it's a popular one. Let me pose this to you. So to read one of them, your audience is interested in tariffs because many of us are paying these tariffs in our supply chain. These tariffs are harmful to many businesses. How likely do you think it is that these tariffs may be removed in the near future? Bob, what do we say?
Depends on what you mean by the near future. If you mean, 3 months, I would say 0. By the end of the year, yeah, I think they'll probably roll back some, but I think it'll be slow. I think, for better or worse, the viewers should expect tariffs, a substantial amount of tariffs for a substantial amount of time.
Damien, I assume.
Yeah. The only thing I'm going to add is that I think to do so, there's going to have to be some give on China's side. It would have to be conditioned on getting, whether it's some sort of opening or you can go down a list of things that China would need to give. So I think there will be some conditions or strings attached anyway. So it probably would involve another round of negotiations of some sort. So I think Bob is certainly right in the 3 to 6 months window. I wouldn't be too optimistic about immediate reversal of tariffs.
Yeah, and that's an interesting take, because I think if you start getting 6 months out, these are no longer the Trump tariffs as much. These are sort of Biden buys in, and then as you say, if you back away, there'll be big debates about did you get enough for making that concession that one owns this. All right, interesting time. lots that we could talk about, but lots that we also covered. That's what we have time for. Let me thank Bob and Damien for sharing their insights on a complicated and important topic. Just a reminder, if you want to read more of what they have to say, they've been prolific, and we had links to that. For all of you, an on-demand version of this webinar will be available shortly after our conclusion, and it can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Please remember to save your spot for the next Logistics Rewired webinar, Flexport Order Management. That is a link in the bottom right. Thank you for joining us, and please stay safe.
Thank you.